as I was perusing social media yesterday, an article popped up which basically just stopped me in my tracks, really. And it was a Lads Bible article about a Jim Carrey interview that he'd given, I think, around 7 years ago, actually. So I don't know why they decided to make a recent kind of thing about it. But he gives some thoughts on the concept of identity, and it just made me really think of autistic masking. So I just thought I'd have a bit of a chat about it today. Now, first up, I am no huge fan of Jim Carrey or anything like that, because I know that he's said some really dodgy stuff before about autism and vaccines, and I think he was in a long-term relationship with Jenny McCarthy a few years back, who does have an autistic son. So I suppose he may well have picked up, some dubious ideas from around that time. So I can only hope that he's educated himself since then, but of course we don't know that. Also, I don't know if Jim Carrey himself is autistic. There is no credible evidence online to suggest so, but that obviously doesn't mean to say that he's not. He could have a diagnosis and have chosen not to share that with the world, and that's completely his own prerogative, but at this time there is no suggestion to say that he is autistic. So Jim Carrey took part in an interview in 2017 with Tiff, and I'll link to the video down below so you can go and watch that afterwards if you'd like to see that. But during this interview he said, "I don't exist. They're all characters that I played, including Jim Carrey, including Joel Barish. They're all characters. Jim Carrey was a less intentional character because I was just building something people would like, but it was a character." And this is just so relatable. If you are new to my channel, I am Lizzie, and I was diagnosed as an autistic person earlier this year at the age of 49. And having that diagnosis in middle age is it's just an overwhelming experience, because it makes you ask just so much about yourself. Autistic masking is all about creating a version of yourself, or a curated version of yourself, to present to the outside world. And sometimes there are kind of varying degrees of this person that you project, depending on the scenario that you're in. So I've behaved differently in different scenarios, or in different kind of settings, because I've felt that I've had to respond positively to the situation that's kind of presented itself to me at that stage. So it's a very complicated set of feelings that you're presented with once you have this diagnosis, or once you realise you're autistic, because once this curated version of yourself is stripped away, then what's left? It does make you ask the big questions in life. And when we think about actors, that's particularly in this day and age, when we think about social media and 24-hour rolling news and people scrolling endlessly for new information, that actors, and particularly well-known actors, have to become almost brands. They often present this perfected version of themselves to the outside world that is, I'd imagine, completely unrealistic in many ways. And I'd say that that was eat into their whole kind of psyche and their whole self-confidence and self-esteem, because they're often not the person or the representation that is shown to us. And rarely do we see or hear celebrities talk about things that really matter to them, because they present a modified version of themselves to the world that is often really bland. And it's really to ensure that they get more work, get more coverage. It seems that the blander you are, the more work you get. And I know for me that I've had to really kind of minimise so many parts of myself through masking, because it just wouldn't be seen as socially acceptable in many ways, and it makes me really sad. I really wish that I could have lived to my full potential and had been encouraged to be the autistic person that I've always been. As I'm sure many of you will relate, we're just forced to make ourselves smaller and quieter and more mainstream. And Jim Carrey goes on to say, I played the guy who was free from concern so that people who watched me would be free from concern. And crikey, this, gosh, speaks volumes, doesn't it? How many times have autistic people been made to feel that they've had to hide something about themselves, to hide their autism, so that other people feel more comfortable? It seems that the person in this scenario that is shown the least amount of compassion and respect and understanding is the autistic person themselves, and I can really see that in Jim's quote here. And Jim also goes on to say, depression is your body saying, fuck you, I don't want to be this character anymore. I don't want to hold up this avatar you've created. It's too much for me. Oh gosh. How can he not be talking about autism? You know, I know he's not. I know he's talking about acting, but for me, the parallels are just massive. And I don't doubt there's been many an autistic YouTuber that has talked about this at some point on their channel, but I just felt compelled to talk about this today because I just couldn't believe the kind of similarities. And when I think about my autistic shutdowns and a breakdown, that's what it's all been about. I just could not do it anymore. I just got to a point where I was just exhausted. I couldn't be what people wanted me to be any longer, and I just needed a break. I just wanted the world to stop and for me to be able to rest and regroup and just have some time to myself. And of course, the concept of identity makes us ask bigger questions, doesn't it? What is identity? What does it mean? Who am I? Do I exist? It does make you ask these questions, and it really makes me think of Descartes here, who said, "We cannot doubt of our existence while we doubt." So maybe there is evidence that we don't actually live in a simulation. So, because it was a Jim Carrey interview, it got me thinking about Jim Carrey films, and as I said earlier, I'm not really a fan of his work, but there are two films of his that I really like, and they're both interestingly to do with identity. The first is The Truman Show, and it's just such a good film because, well, it's completely iconic, isn't it? It's so unique in its storytelling, and essentially it's about individual identity and societal constructs. And if you haven't seen it, and I'll be surprised if you haven't, I'd recommend that you go and check it out. It's so good. And the second film of his that I really like is Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, and it is such a beautiful film, and it explores identity, memory, the breakdown of relationships, and the consequences of removing memories. And it concludes that memories are essentially a huge part of who we are, and how memories tie in with our own sense of identity. Now, if you've been watching my videos for a while, you will know that I have just the most terrible memory. And I will do a video on memory at some point, because I've learned that a lot of autistic people actually do have real issues with episodic memory. Although the stereotypical view of autistic people is that we're all supposed to have amazing photographic memories, but that couldn't be further from the truth for some of us. And I can't remember huge swathes of my life, and particularly when I was a child, I've got very little memory recall from that time, and it's incredibly frustrating. And if memories are so integral and intrinsic to who we are, if we don't have access to long-term memories, what does that then do to our sense of identity? So this made me think of Thomas Reid, who was a Scottish philosopher, and I think I originally came across this from the Philosophy Tube channel, but Thomas Reid had a theory about identity and memory. He asked us to imagine an old general who was once a brave officer in the army, and he was also a young boy who stole apples from an orchard and was flogged as a consequence. And he theorised that if the old general can remember being the brave officer in the army, and if both the old general and the brave officer can remember being the boy who stole those apples from the orchards, then they are all ultimately the same person, because there's a series of memories involved that the old general can remember. If, however, the old general can remember being the brave officer, but he can't remember being that boy who once stole those apples, then they cannot be the same person. Thomas Reid argued that memory itself isn't sufficient to establish personal identity, and he thought instead that people should be identified with immaterial substance, or their soul, which remains the same over time. And I guess when you think about people that get amnesia at some point in their life, or they may well go into a dissociative fugue state, so they remember none of their previous life, then I guess you could argue that, yeah, they're a different person from the person that they were before, because they have no access to those memories or no understanding of who they were before. I don't doubt that this was a really groundbreaking and profound way of thinking during Reid's lifetime, but for me, with our new understanding of trauma and its long-term effects, that's if we consider an adult who remembers much of their childhood but doesn't remember traumatic events within that childhood, and then goes on to develop a post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a really common scenario, then surely the child who experienced the trauma and the adult who doesn't remember the trauma but has a post-traumatic stress disorder, they have to be the same person, because the adult is experiencing a consequence of the child's trauma. But for me, I don't know, I think as we age, I think we do become different versions of ourselves at different stages in our lives, you know. I feel like a very different person to the version of myself at, say, 22, who went off to move to London because I thought that was the thing that you should do. And in hindsight, it was all about me trying to escape from myself and past trauma, really. But instead, I now was living in a scenario that was highly stressful, and I'd use alcohol almost daily to get through it. Nor am I the child that I once was, that I barely remember, who just lived a really stressful life. I felt like I was excluded from the world in many ways, and I felt really like a second class kind of person, because I just was so different to my peers and contemporaries. So I don't know, I feel like there are different versions of yourself that appear throughout your life that feel almost disconnected from one another, and that's how my version of autistic masking feels, at least, because I've had to project different versions of myself to different groups of people throughout my life. So it's left me feeling in a somewhat confused state some of the time, I have to say. And although I feel disconnected from myself as a child because of these lack of memories, I do try and connect with that person, because I feel like I owe her something, because she went through just an enormous amount of trauma, and I want to recognise that, because I feel that the child that I once was deserves that, really. And incidentally, I do try and keep that young girl alive through the drawings that I use on my channel. They're really all about acknowledging that younger version of myself that I think needs acknowledgements. So while making this video, I did a quick search to see if Jim Carrey had said anything else that was relevant to this video, and there is a quote on depression. He says, "I believe depression is legitimate, but I also believe that if you don't exercise, eat nutritious food, get sunlight, get enough sleep, consume positive material, surround yourself with support, then you aren't giving yourself a fighting chance." And while that's lovely for Jim Carrey to say these things and to believe these things, they're actually really ableist, aren't they? And it really frustrates me when people of privilege come out with these pearls of wisdom or these sweeping statements as to how you can make your life a whole lot better just by doing whatever a celebrity suggests, really. And I know that when I've been in my darkest depressions, having access to nutritious food, say, has been completely out of reach. I've had some bouts of agoraphobia in my life, and the thoughts of going out every few days to get fresh, nutritious food would have, oh, it's just a joke, really, isn't it? It's he's speaking absolutely from a position of privilege there, and it really shows. So yeah, have I been a method actor throughout my life? In many ways, it does feel like that. I've got vivid memories of seeing other people do stuff that I've taken and used at some points in my life because I thought that's how I should respond to something that's happened in the moment. And it's not felt natural, it's not felt spontaneous, and I imagine that there's a lot of parallels with acting. And I'm not an actor, I've got no experience of acting whatsoever. I think I was in one stage production when I was young. I'm no expert, but the whole idea of acting and being a high masking autistic person, I just think there's a lot of parallels there. So I don't know if this video's made a whole lot of sense, really, because I only came across this article and there hasn't been a whole lot of scripting to this video, I have to say, but I'd love to hear your take on acting and high masking autism. Do you think that there are parallels? Because I can't help but think that there are, to be honest. But anyway, please leave your thoughts down below because I would be really interested to hear your views too. So thank you for watching. Give it a like if you got this far, and I'll see you again soon.